Hey, I'm Jonathan. Welcome to Rather Be Riffing. So the channel is 8 subscribers away from hitting 10,000, and I can't think of a cooler way to celebrate the milestone than by making this video and sharing it with you today. So I had the incredible opportunity to demo a genuine 1959 and 1960 Les Paul Standard for Brian's Guitars in Cheshire, Connecticut. I've bought and sold many amazing instruments through their shop over the years, and most recently, I acquired my vintage 1961 ES335 there. And when I was picking up the 335, the guys pulled something special out of the vault, which was a genuine 1959 burst. And it was the first time I ever had the opportunity to play one. I got to noodle on it for a few minutes. We got talking, and the guy said it'd be great if I'd come down and help them film a demo of not only the 1959 burst, but the 1960 burst they also had. And so here we are. We're going down the burst rabbit hole today. So I'm going to do several sound demonstrations of the 1959 and 1960 burst. I'll talk about the playability and the feel of these instruments. I'll get into some of the differences I noticed between the 59 and the 60. I'll also share some of my observations as to the similarities and differences I noticed between these vintage examples and their modern counterparts. Then lastly, I'll finish off with sharing what my personal experience was like finally getting to handle these legendary instruments and how they lived up to the lore and wonder that's built up in my mind over a lifetime of being fascinated by them. So let's get into it. And so while Graham and Jesse were setting up the filming studio, I had the unique opportunity to get up close and personal with both of these bursts. I took a ton of footage, so I'll share all that with you along the way here. And so let's start with the 59. When I opened up the case, I was immediately struck by how much color was left on this burst. As we all know, these aniline dyes fade over time due to exposure to UV lighting. At least the 59s do. They switched over to a different dye type in 1960 that was less vulnerable to fading. I'll get into that later when we look at the 1960 burst. This one does remind me a little bit of Red Eye, currently owned by Jason Isabel, formerly owned by Ed King. It has a little bit of that fading above the toggle switch that reminds me a bit of that unique wear pattern on Red Eye. This one has double white PAFs, which are clearly exposed. The guard is off. And I think it gives this guitar a really cool look, along with a very tight curl and three-dimensional figuring. So the guitar is all original, save for the tuners. It currently has double ring cloisons installed. The original single ring cloison tuners are in the case. A couple of the tulip buttons have shrunk, which is very common for these guitars. This particular example is featured in The Beauty of the Burst. If you were to take a peek at page 165, you can find a photo of it here. What's really cool is that the coloring in this photo is spot on to what the guitar currently looks like. So that tells me that the guitar at least has been stored away from light for nearly the past 30 years since this book was published in 1996. So as I'm recounting this experience, it's sort of blowing my mind here. Not only did I get to open up that 1959 flight case, moments later, here I am opening up the 1960 burst flight case. What was cool about that moment is I had never seen this 1960 burst. I had an encounter with the 59 a few months prior when I had bought my 335, and the guys gave me a quick peek at it. However, this 1960 was a mystery. I had no clue what it looked like or what to expect. And so that moment when I unlatched and opened that case What really struck me about that 1960 was the deep red. Now, I don't know when in 1960 they switched to the new dye formulation or whether the deeper coloring is a result of that or not, but quite striking and quite beautiful. The other thing I notice is the flame pattern. This one has a much more wild and erratic pattern that is beautiful in its own right compared to the tighter curl of the 1959. I think that's one of the things that makes Les Pauls so cool, especially from this era, is that old Eastern Michigan maple just has a certain vibe to it. Each piece is very unique, very 3D, very iridescent, and quite beautiful. I also noticed this one had a fair amount of honest playwear, which indicates that it's been much loved and much played over the years. So one of the things I've come to really appreciate about the burst is that there's a lot of nuance to their beauty and charm that unfolds over time the more you key in and tune into some of those subtleties. And I'll get into some of those details as we go. But one of the things I've lately keyed in on that I really appreciate about those original bursts is the quality of the mahogany that was used back then. It is distinctly different from the mahogany that you see being used today. And what Gibson used in the late 50s was Honduran mahogany. And many report that it was old growth Honduran mahogany, which means two things really. One, those trees grew in a natural forest environment, which was healthier for them, and the wood grew to be more dense and have certain characteristics that was desirable for musical instrument making. And the other aspect to old growth is that it's been said that those particular trees were harvested many decades prior, so they had time to naturally season and dry out, which is ideal for instrument making. Now, this wood is also visually distinct. Taking a look at the beauty of the burst photos, you can see many of these examples have super tight and straight grained mahogany backs. There's some exceptions depending on how the mahogany was cut. However, the majority of them have this tight straight grain characteristic. Now, these two examples today, the 59 and 60, both were the quintessential examples of my favorite types of mahogany backs, perfectly straight and tight grained. Now, this stuff is quite visually different from the wood that Gibson uses today, which comes from plantations in Fiji. On average, this wood is less straight grained and less tight grained. It's often quite swirly. And I've owned several examples. This Murphy Lab Heavy Age from 2024 is no exception. Taking a look at the mahogany on the back, you can see that it's quite wavery and the grain patterns aren't straight or tightly grained as they are in those original 59 and 60 examples. Of course, Gibson was using Brazilian rosewood for the fingerboards in 59 and 1960, and these are two beautiful examples. The 59's board is a little darker, but you can see the beautiful oily characteristic and almost wax-like patina. And by comparison, the 1960 Brazilian board has a little more browns and reds in it. It's also quite beautiful in its own right, and I think it goes to show just how much Brazilian rosewood can vary in its appearance from darks to browns to reds. Nonetheless, I think both boards flatter the aesthetic of their respective guitars quite well. Another really cool and unique aspect that makes each of these guitars so unique is the way that they age, and in particular how the lacquer ages. The nitrocellulose lacquer will shrink over time as the wood expands and contracts. With changes in temperature, it can cause the lacquer to check and crack as well. And so what was interesting about these two examples is that the 59 was void of any weather checking whatsoever. And I think that's consistent with the fact that it has retained a lot of its original color, which indicates it hasn't been exposed to the elements and hasn't had the opportunity to weather check. The 1960 by comparison does have some weather checking, which also is consistent with the fact that this guitar seems like it has been played and loved quite a bit. So it's been out and about more and perhaps exposed to the elements a little bit more, leading to some of that natural and beautiful checking over time. Another unique facet about the way these guitars age is the trapezoid inlays. You can see if we look closely that there's some space around the inlays. So the cellulose material used in these inlays has a tendency to shrink over time. Additionally, when these inlays were routed, it was a lot of handwork back in the late 50s, and it wasn't as precise as the CNC routing done today. And so they would end up with some tiny gaps around the trapezoid inlays that they would fill in with rosewood sawdust and fish glue. And things like players' sweat and hand chemistry can break down those glues over time and can start to expose some of that gap. I think it gives it a quite beautiful and aged and antiqued look. As for some of the differences I noticed between the 59 and 60, I'll start with some of the general differences in spec that apply across all examples. Some of those differences are obvious from the outside, and some of them are more hidden on the inside. And then I'll finish off by talking about some of the differences I noticed between these two specific examples. So some of the general differences from the outside between a 59 and 60 burst is, of course, as I mentioned earlier, the aniline dye formula changed so that it was less vulnerable to UV exposure. That change occurred in 1960, so those bursts tend to take on a different hue and retain more of their color over time. The tulip tips on the tuners are also different between a 59 and 60. In 59, they're single ring Clousson tuners, and in 60, they introduced double ring Clousson tuners. As I mentioned earlier, the 59 has a set of replacement 60 tuners on it, as the original 59 tuners have shrunk and are in the case. The 1960 has reflector knobs, whereas the 1959 has non-reflector knobs. And the last big change from the outside is the neck profile. They slimmed down the necks in 1960 as well. And I'll talk more about the feel of the necks and the playability of the guitars a bit later. As for some of the differences on the inside of the guitar, there is a slight difference in construction. In 1960, they switched over to a shorter neck tenon. Now, you can see this if you were to remove the neck pickup from the guitar and inspect the tenon. Now, between the thinner neck profile and the shorter neck tenon, some folks report that that changes the voice of the 60 ever so slightly. I think Joe Bonamassa had said he tends to really like the 60s as they have a little bit more of a brighter, aggressive sort of characteristic. I wasn't necessarily hearing that among these two particular examples, and I think that goes to show you general rules of thumb don't always apply in every circumstance. And I'll talk more about what I was hearing sonically between these two guitars in a bit. And so the last hidden difference is in the pots. While they both use 500K spec pots manufactured by Central Lab, the tolerances are different in late 50s versus early 60s. In the late 50s, they were spec'd to 500K, but with a 20% plus or minus tolerance. So out of the factory, these pots could be anywhere between 400 and 600K. So there can be a lot of variability in the late 50 pot values, and that can influence the degree of brightness that the guitar has. The higher the pot value, the more brightness on average. Whereas in 1960, the tolerances of the Central Lab pots got tighter. So as a starting point, they were more consistent and closer to the 500K spec value. Now, Central Labs are vulnerable to drifting over time. They tend to go up in value. It's not uncommon for burst pots to read as high as 700 or 800K. I have an original 1958 Central Lab harness, and the pots do measure anywhere between 600K and 750K. Now, the 1960 pots, of course, can drift as well, but they have a lower starting point and are more consistent overall. And I think that helps maybe explain a little bit of some of the sonic differences I was hearing, and I'll elaborate a bit on that later. So I would love to know what sound differences you guys are hearing between these two guitars. And I'd love to share some of my observations. So acoustically, there is certainly something apparent about these guitars when you play them for the first time. They're very lively, and they have an almost spring-like sensitivity to them where notes sort of just jump off the fingerboard in all registers. They also have this very distinct metallic ping that's more pronounced on these vintage examples than I've encountered on their modern equivalents. You can hear that like certain metally ping.
Yep, for sure. I need to take vacation.
And I do think that that comes through the amp as well, because I do find these original PAF pickups are very microphonic. They are unforgiving, and they pick up every little detail and nuance, whether intentional or not. And I think that's what gives these guitars such a unique and expressive voice. I find that you really have to dig in a lot more on modern guitars to get that type of personality and character out of them, whereas it's almost inherent and built in as the bass line on these bursts. I did find that the pickups were quite different between the two guitars. Most notably, the bridge pickup on the 59 was a very aggressive sound and a little brighter on average than the 1960. Now, acoustically, the guitars sounded very comparable. Only plugged in did they sound a little different in the bridge position. So I attribute that to either the PAF winding on the 59 and or the pot values. As I spoke about earlier, it's quite possible that the pot values are higher on the bridge pickup on the 59 due to the wider tolerances of the era and or drift over time. And I quite enjoyed that aggressive attitude that the 59 had in the bridge position. And of course, it's easy to dial that out with the tone knob. Hard to dial that in if it's not there in the first place. The other unique thing that contributed to that guitar's particular voice is the middle position. I thought was very unique. You may have noticed when I switched from the neck position to the middle position, it's almost like a low shelf was added that reduced the low end of the guitar. It didn't sound anemic by any stretch, but it almost had that out of phase characteristic. I don't know if these two pickups happen to be wired out of phase or not. I just noticed that in the middle position, there tended to be low end roll off. And I think that really enhanced that quacky, unique middle position character on that guitar. The 1960 by comparison, I thought both pickups were a little more balanced. I didn't find the bridge pickup as aggressive, but I did find that it lacked nothing in terms of being able to rock out and get loud and still be articulate. But as always, I'm curious to hear what you guys are picking up in the sound sample so far. Let me know. So for those of you that are wondering, how close is Gibson getting today with their modern recreations? Let's go there. So I think Gibson's getting a lot right these days, and I think they're making bursts closer than they ever have before. Now, I'll first talk about what I think they're getting right, and then I'll talk about where there are still some key differences. They're getting the overall design right. These things have the right neck angle, top carve is good. The logo, the headstock shape, all that's good. Of course, everything is spec'd out with the right pot values, PAF style pickups, etc., etc. So in terms of the construction spec, they're building replicas in that regard. One question mark is on the scale length. They say it's 24.75 inches. Gibson has recently come out with the best of series where they're modeling examples from the Beauty of the Burst, and the specs on those have a slightly shorter scale length like the originals. Standard R9s still have the straight up 24.75 inch scale length, so there's still that slight difference in spec. I did notice in terms of the aging, if you go Murphy Lab, there's a lot that they get right about the aging. In particular, the rolled fingerboard edges on this particular Murphy Lab were spot on to the original 59 Les Paul that I had played. And those rolled fingerboard edges feel great, and they do make a difference in terms of the playability. Some of the wear patterns, while those are going to be unique to each individual guitar, when you handle the real thing, you start to then get a better understanding for what Murphy Lab is doing with the choices they make in their aging. Now, I must say, this is a heavy aged example, which was far more extreme than either the 59 or 60 genuine examples I played. The 60 had some honest play wear, but was nowhere near what I would consider a heavy aged Murphy Lab. Now, where things start to become a bit more noticeably different for me personally is there's just something about the original burst finish that I don't think Gibson has nailed yet. And the combination of the original lacquer formula, aniline dyes, and those woods create a beautiful 3D peekaboo effect where the wood just looks different from every angle, from being heavily figured to not having figure, and it just has this three-dimensional quality. I very rarely find that in a modern build, and I suspect it's a combination of those three variables, just slight differences in the wood used today, the lacquer formula, and the aniline dyes. Other differences, PAF pickups is a whole other rabbit hole in terms of trying to recreate the magic and idiosyncrasies of the originals, so I won't get into that. I think the custom buckers are a good approximation, but they're probably 85% of the sonic characteristics of the original PAFs that I've sampled. Additionally, Gibson's also using mostly the proper metals, using the brass thumb wheels, the steel bridge posts, brass saddles. The ABR1 metal is not an exact recreation. To what degree that affects the sound, I don't know. You have the aluminum tailpiece, which is correct. So overall, the metals are fairly close to the originals. As for the pots, the modern guitars have CTS 500K pots. People say the Central Labs do sound different for whatever reason. whether it's the original carbon tracks or some of the materials that were used in the construction that are no longer safe for the environment to manufacture with. Nonetheless, folks say they sound different. It could also partly be the way that those old pots drift over time in their values. So I think Gibson is doing probably as good of a job as you can do with materials that are available for mass-produced instruments today. And all in all, this is a great sounding guitar, regardless of how close it is to the original burst specs. So as good as the modern day Gibson reissues have gotten, there's still something unique about the feel of the original bursts. And the main thing I want to key in on is the neck profile. I want to start out by referencing a wonderful interview on Tim Pierce's YouTube channel where him and Pete Thorne are hanging out with Gil Yaron. I think Matt from Vertical Horizon is also in the mix. Wonderful interview, check it out, I'll drop the link below. But they're talking about bursts, and Gil is a world famous luthier who has built some exacting replicas of bursts and some of his own wonderful models as well. Gil had measured several late 50s Gibson necks, and he says not a single one of them measured straight in the sense of having a uniform carve up and down. And that has everything to do with how they were made. They would do the final shaping of the neck profile on the same machine that they would carve the tops on, which is a slack belt sander. So they would literally hold the neck and just rock it underneath the underside of the slack belt sander and just do it by feel. That resulted in, of course, every neck being somewhat unique. And so both of these examples, the 59 and 60, had that characteristic of the necks just felt wonderful up and down in my hand. And I attribute that to the organic asymmetrical carving that was an artifact of how they were made back in the day. I don't fully understand how Gibson does it today, but my impression is that it's more CNC carved and less handwork, but I would love if anybody has any inside information there to please clarify in the comments down below. The other thing about these guitars from a playing experience and feel point of view, again, that certain springiness and bounce they have in terms of how they respond to pick attack. The old cliche of the notes just jump off the fingerboard rings true with these guitars. They give back more than you put in also rings true, much more than the average guitar that I've encountered. And so that also creates a very inspiring playing experience. And so I think the guitars lived up to their reputation on both those dimensions of having super comfortable organic neck carves and a very lively responsiveness. The 60 profile was thinner. It was not as thin as my early 60s 335, which has the slim taper, almost blade, super shallow carve. It has more meat on it than that. It's actually very similar in depth to the Collings I-35 LC neck depth. The 59 carve didn't feel much like my Murphy Lab. The current Murphy Labs are using the medium C carve, as they call it. I'm sure it's replica of the benchmark guitar they modeled it off, but as I mentioned, these carves were all over the place. So if anyone out there has had the good fortune of playing an example of any of these original 59, 60, or even 58 bursts, I would love to hear from you. What was your perspective and experience on the necks and the playability, or your observations in general? Let me know in the comments below. Time for the big question. How did these original bursts live up to the lore and wonder built up in my mind over a lifetime of being fascinated by these instruments? And I'm still in a bit of a surreal state that I actually got to experience that. It was such a unique opportunity, and one I'm extremely grateful for, not only for Brian's guitars and for Graham making that an extremely memorable and simple, easy experience.
The hard part of my job.
But also for you as the listeners for coming along on this journey with me and building up the channel over time, which has led to cool opportunities like this. So thank you, and I hope you enjoy sharing in this passion of guitar and Les Pauls and bursts with me. So thank you. But back to the question, I'm of two minds. One is, yes, these guitars essentially lived up to the hype. Simultaneously, it did sober me a bit to the reality that at the end of the day, they are tools. And so I'll try to reconcile those two conflicting thoughts. So in terms of living up to the lore and the hype, as I talked about, there is something distinct about these guitars visually and sonically. From a visual perspective, personally, I think the Les Paul is the most beautiful electric guitar design. And getting to see these guitars in person was every bit as good, if not better, as thumbing through the Beauty of the Burst book or checking out these cool videos online. There's a very distinct aura that these guitars have, and it's a combination, I think, of the unique materials and the various ways that these guitars age over the years that give them all distinct, unique personalities. And so that was wonderful to get to see these guitars in the flesh and experience that firsthand. So that very much lived up to the lore and hype for me. Sonically and playing-wise, these guitars also delivered to the reputation. Now, there could be some confirmation bias here. I was able to get some of the nerves out of the way the first time I got to handle the guitar at Brian's shop. This is a bucket list, just to get to handle one of the I like to believe I was a little more objective when I went in the second time to do the demos. But nonetheless, the guitars do have a certain responsiveness to them. Notes kind of jump and spring off the fingerboard, gives more energy than you put into it. And even acoustically, they have a very distinct voice. There's a certain metallic ping that they have and a certain resonance that I don't quite hear in their modern counterparts, as good as they are and as close as they've gotten with the modern Gibson reissues. So I do think there's something unique and special about these guitars. At the same time, it did humble me to the reality that at the end of the day, the guitar is a vehicle for your creative expression ultimately. And while the bursts do something very unique and special at unlocking that creative expression, I think they have a very vocal-like quality. Again, the microphonics, the sensitivity, the responsiveness. You feel quite exposed playing them because they pick up every little nuance of your finger movements, whether intentional or not. And I think that makes them special. I also think the modern Gibsons get you 85% or more of the way there. I think there's boutique builders that are getting it a little closer than that. And I think just looking at the amount of options we have today versus the options players had back in the late 50s and 60s when these guitars were around and getting discovered, it's an embarrassment of riches in terms of the quality, the options, and the different price points available today. There's just amazing instruments being made today. As much as I'd love to go back in a time machine and grab myself a 59, I'm okay in this modern times with having this abundance of choice. And the reality is that most of us, myself included, are not in a position to swing an original as much as I would like to someday be able to. That being said, whoever ends up with these guitars, I hope you enjoy the heck out of them. They're not only historically significant pieces, they're just amazing instruments in their own right, and I hope they bring a ton of joy. So I would love to do a follow-up video of this one, so let me know if you have any questions, things I didn't address in the video, or other things you're curious about. I have additional footage, some behind-the-scenes stuff. We can get into some of the gear and signal chain used, how I got some of the tones. So let me know what you're thinking. I would love to consider that in an upcoming video. Also, if you love burst content, go check out Brian's Guitars YouTube channel. They'll also have several videos featuring these two guitars and my demo playing. Jesse captured a ton of B-roll, so you'll get a lot more high quality, up close, detailed shots of these guitars and just get to see how beautiful they are up close and personal. If you happen to be in the market for a burst, which is probably 0.01% of people watching this, get in touch with Brian's. They'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. So thanks everyone for your continued support. If you'd like to support the channel further, or if you're interested in the type of music that I play, I do write and compose all my own original music here on my channel. I do have some recorded music available for listening or purchase on Bandcamp, so the link is below if you want to check that out. Thanks to Jesse from Hollow Hill Media for the beautiful videography and for sharing the high resolution files with me. Otherwise, as always, thanks a ton for watching, and I will see you in the next video.